The very first written words created by humanity may not have marked the beginning, but rather served as the poignant, final testament of a civilization facing imminent collapse. Pressed into damp clay by hands acutely aware of their race against time, these documents were intended to survive the ending of their world. In the arid, silent expanse of southern Iraq, the vestiges of once mighty ancient cities lie buried, preserving beneath their collapsed walls tens of thousands of fragmented clay tablets. Each fragment is meticulously covered with wedge-shaped impressions known as cuneiform, a script that holds the oldest continuous written records of human thought ever discovered. What is most perplexing about these records is that they do not document the clumsy, halting efforts expected of a civilization just learning to write. The discovery of these texts, largely unfolding through meticulous archaeological work in the late 19th century, was far from dramatic. European archaeologists excavating near the sprawling ruins of the ancient city of Uruk, biblical Erech, began unearthing immense brick mounds that had been solidified by millennia under the relentless Mesopotamian sun. Breaking through the hardened surface, they accessed subterranean chambers filled with meticulously organized, stacked, and deliberately preserved clay tablets. These archives contained thousands upon thousands of documents, each often no larger than a modern paperback, yet covered in incredibly intricate script. When linguistic experts finally deciphered the language, they realized they were not reading rudimentary scribbles. Instead, the tablets held complex records, sophisticated tax ledgers, detailed medical prescriptions, precise astronomical observations, formal legal contracts, and sacred hymns dedicated to a pantheon of gods whose names had faded from memory over 4,000 years. The people who authored this script were named the Sumerians. From the moment this civilization entered the historical record, a profound anomaly in our understanding of history became apparent. Sumer seemingly did not evolve. It emerged complete around 3,500 BCE in an extraordinarily brief span of time by archaeological standards. Sophisticated urban centers suddenly flourished across southern Mesopotamia. These cities displayed advanced urban planning, monumental ziggurat architecture, complex irrigation systems, and a revolutionary sexagesimal base 6-0 mathematical system, a legacy that endures today in our measurements of time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and angles 360 degrees. Their cuneiform script, even in its earliest known form, was highly developed, comprising over 700 distinct symbols. Their massive temple complexes, vital administrative and religious centers were meticulously aligned with celestial events. Furthermore, their trade networks were vast, stretching far beyond the Fertile Crescent, connecting the Persian Gulf with regions as distant as the Mediterranean and the Indus Valley. This level of sudden, simultaneous complexity defies conventional historical progression. History typically favors slow, traceable developments. The gradual evolution from simple stone tools to metallurgy, from basic hunter-gatherer camps to stratified urban societies, and from simple pictographs into complex alphabets. Sumer, however, appears to have completely bypassed this developmental rehearsal, stepping onto the world stage fully formed and highly organized. Scholars have devoted over a century to reconciling this anomaly. Some theorize that the earlier, simpler developmental stages of Sumerian civilization simply haven't been found, hypothesizing that relentless environmental erosion and the passage of time have erased these fumbling centuries. Others suggest that Sumer was the beneficiary of inherited knowledge, potentially borrowing from neighboring pre-existing cultures that were subsequently lost to history, perhaps wiped out by devastating floods or conflicts. However, the Sumerians themselves provided a very different explanation recorded in their own monumental texts. The Sumerian king list, a composite of several ancient tablets, famously begins, "After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." Crucially, their texts repeatedly emphasize the concept of restoration, not invention, suggesting that everything they built was an act of recovering and rebuilding a great civilization that had existed before their time. Imagine examining one of these ancient tablets in a museum archive today. The cool, rough clay bears the intricate wedge marks, each one deliberately impressed by a stylus made from a reed wielded by a scribe who lived 5 millennia ago. On certain tablets, a truly intimate connection to the past remains visible. Preserved fingerprints and thumbprints pressed into the soft clay before it was baked hard. These telltale ridges belonged to a Sumerian scribe who lived before the Egyptian pyramids, before the monumental constructions of Mesoamerica. This person was dedicated to recording knowledge they deemed essential for survival. Among these meticulously preserved records are complex astronomical tables, tracking the precise movements of Venus data which rivaled the accuracy achieved in Europe only with the advent of the telescope. There are also advanced multiplication tables and practical lessons instructing students on how to calculate compound interest. Medical texts detail early surgical procedures and prescribe sophisticated plant-based remedies, demonstrating a deep understanding of botany and pharmacology. Perhaps most compelling are their cosmological myths, which describe the creation of humanity from clay mixed with divine essence and which chronicle a long, difficult process involving trial, error, and failed prototypes spanning generations. Running through nearly all of their written traditions is the persistent, unifying theme of a world before the flood, pre-Diluvian, an age when knowledge was said to flow freely, when their rulers lived for impossibly long reigns, and when beings described as those who came from the heavens instructed humanity in the arts of civilization and the science of measuring the stars. While such mythology is easily dismissed as fantasy, its widespread repetition across diverse cultures appearing in Akkadian tablets, Hebrew scripture, the Genesis account, Hindu Vedas, and even Mesoamerican codices suggests a deeply shared global memory, potentially carried by survivors of a massive catastrophe. This hypothesis gained archaeological weight in the 1922 when Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur. His team unexpectedly struck a deep, sterile layer of clean flood silt over 2 meters thick, sandwiched precisely between distinct, datable occupation layers. This identical sterile clay layer appears at other crucial Sumerian sites, including Shuruppak, Kish, and Eridu, all dated to roughly the same period described in the Sumerian flood myths. While likely not a global event, this regional catastrophe was severe enough to devastate and reset civilization across the entire Mesopotamian plain. The implication is profound. The Sumerians were not inventing a myth, they were documenting a historical disaster. Their tablets clearly divide their world into a time before and a time after, separated by ruinous water. Every act of rebuilding every city wall, every temple, every star chart was an attempt to salvage, recover, and reconstruct what had been lost. When archaeologists explored the Ziggurat at Uruk, they did not find primitive structures. They discovered 6 miles of expertly built defensive walls, precise water systems engineered with advanced mathematics, and a massive temple complex precisely aligned to track the winter solstice. The excavation of a collapsed library there yielded over 40,000 tablets, an archive vast enough to document virtually every aspect of Sumerian life, from trade routes to cosmic observations. Yet nowhere do the Sumerians claim to have invented this knowledge. They repeatedly describe receiving it, preserving it, and restoring it from surviving fragments. This phrase, "this is the restoration of what was before," is a recurring dedication carved into stone and temple inscriptions meant to withstand the test of empires. The Sumerians, in this context, viewed themselves not as brilliant pioneers of civilization, but as archaeologists of a much older, lost age, meticulously digging through the rubble of a forgotten catastrophe to recover the essential knowledge of their forebears. In modern museums, a small clay cylinder might rest behind glass, its cuneiform dedication describing the construction of a temple to Inanna. Even here, nestled between the formal language of kingship and prayer, is that striking phrase, the restoration of what was before. The faint fingerprints of the scribe who shaped the cylinder 4,500 years ago, preserved forever in the wet clay, belonged to someone convinced they were saving something, not creating it. They were preserving the memory of a world so utterly erased by disaster that only these fragments survived, pressed into clay by hands that understood the weight of being the final generation. The tablets themselves have proven astonishingly resilient. Unlike fragile parchment or wood, the clay records did not burn. The heat of a catastrophic fire, in fact, served to bake them harder, permanently preserving them like ceramic objects in a kiln. This accidental permanence, a product of the very disasters meant to erase them, ensured that the Sumerian memory survived. Even today, where the desert temperature exceeds 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the broken geometric shapes of Uruk's ruins stand as a testament to walls that once protected a population of over 80,000 people. The whisper they carry across millennia is clear. This is not the beginning of human history. It is merely what they managed to save. The ancient city of Uruk's walls, some 6 miles in circumference, once provided a formidable defense for a population that swelled to potentially 80,000 residents, making it the largest city in the world at its peak. Today, these ramparts and the monumental temple platforms dedicated to deities like Inanna and Anu, where ceremonies were once conducted beneath skies tracked by priests, stand as little more than broken geometric remnants of sun-baked mud brick. The Iraqi desert environment is one of constant flux, where the fine sand continuously performs a geological function of burying and revealing, yet always preserving the heavy, resistant clay. When the earliest European archaeological expeditions arrived in the region during the 1872 and 1882 led by figures such as Hormuz Rassam, Ernest de Sarzec, and Robert Coldiway, they were driven by a desire for grand discovery. Their primary objective was the glamorous loot of history, royal tombs, precious statues, and legendary gold. What they actually uncovered were the dusty, forgotten storage rooms of administrative centers, crammed not with treasures, but with what appeared to be utterly unglamorous bureaucratic debris. Mountains of receipts, commodity inventories, land sale contracts, and mundane personnel rosters. Yet, when these tablets were painstakingly cleaned, cataloged, and the cuneiform script finally deciphered by linguists, the initially mundane contents dissolved into the truly extraordinary. These clay documents revealed a society possessing a fully integrated and complex body of knowledge from its inception, One tablet from Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, details the precise rations barley, oil, and wool distributed to the extensive network of temple laborers. Another shows a student's mathematics homework demonstrating facility with multiplication tables, squares, and cube roots, indicating a sophisticated educational system. Adjacent to it, a medical text prescribes detailed treatments for various ailments, including complex infections, often utilizing a sophisticated phytotherapy involving compounds of thyme, cedar, and fermented barley, a form of early antibiotic. In the same archive, scholars found lyrical hymns praising the goddess Inanna, alongside detailed astronomical instructions for predicting lunar eclipses, complex legal cases involving disputed property boundaries, and a sophisticated farmer's almanac that advised on seasonal irrigation based on the intricate flooding patterns of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was not a civilization tentatively discovering its capacity for thought. It was a culture already profoundly fluent in every dialect of human knowledge, from the sacred to the mundane, from abstract mathematics to practical engineering. The linguistic and architectural anomaly, the earliest Sumerian tablets dated between approximately 3,500 and 3,200 BCE, present content that is fully formed from the very start. There is no evidence of the expected primitive stages or tentative experiments with crude symbols. The cuneiform system bursts into existence, capable of conveying abstract legal concepts, intricate poetic metaphors, precise astronomical data, and overwhelming administrative complexity simultaneously. Linguists consider this an anomaly of development. Standard writing systems, such as Egyptian hieroglyphs, slowly evolved from simple, recognizable pictographs, becoming more abstract and phonetic over centuries of gradual transformation. Similarly, the Chinese writing system traces its slow, organic development from early oracle bone scratches into its complex modern form. Even the Western alphabet required millennia of subtle changes, from Phoenician to Greek to Latin. In stark contrast, Sumerian cuneiform arrives on the historical stage, fully perfected and rehearsed. It is not just the writing that is anomalous, it is the sophistication of the world it describes. Among the earliest tablets recovered at Uruk is a cadastral survey, essentially a comprehensive land registry. This survey meticulously documents field boundaries, tracks the flow of vital irrigation channels, and codifies property ownership across the entire city-state. Such an undertaking necessitates not only widespread literacy but also mastery of geometry, advanced surveying techniques, standardized, consistent units of measurement, and a multi-generational bureaucracy capable of maintenance and enforcement. All of these advanced features were present in the earliest archaeological layers. Simultaneously, tablets unearthed at Eridu, the city traditionally revered as the most ancient in Sumerian tradition, contain elaborate temple hymns that consistently reference structures, deities, and rituals considered older still. The priests of Eridu did not claim to be founders. They asserted they were maintainers of an ancient tradition. One powerful inscription found at the temple of the god Enki reads, "The house whose foundation was laid in the sacred place, whose ancient designs are carried forward from distant days, not built for the first time, not established here, but carried forward from distant days." Scholars initially dismissed such language as mere religious rhetoric, designed to inflate an institution's age and authority, a common practice across ancient cultures. However, this pattern of claiming restoration, not creation, repeats with disconcerting consistency throughout Sumerian texts. At the city-state of Lagash, a boundary stone erected around 2450 BCE detailed a treaty between two rival factions. Before outlining the new agreement, The inscription begins by stating that the border was originally established by the god Ningeru in ancient times, and that this boundary is now restored again. In their most sacred city, Nippur, where the most dedicated scribes trained, temple inventories itemize sacred objects passed down from before the time of memory. The Sumerians presented themselves not as the revolutionary pioneers who invented civilization, but as custodians and caretakers of a profound, highly technical legacy originating from an earlier, forgotten epoch. This profound cultural humility is inconsistent with the historical context. The Ubaid culture that immediately preceded Sumer in the same geographical area was characterized by small, isolated farming villages utilizing simple pottery and basic tools. There is an unmistakable cultural discontinuity, a massive, inexplicable gap where conventional developmental models demand centuries of slow, transitional evolution towards urbanization and technological complexity. Yet, the Sumerian myths contain no stories of discovering writing, inventing the wheel, or developing mathematics. Instead, their myths uniformly describe the reception of knowledge being taught by divine figures, the Anunnaki, who are said to have descended from the heavens, bringing with them the fully perfected tools of civilization known as the Me. A passage from the epic poem Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta offers a curious narrative. It describes a time when there was a state of universal peace and unity. Once upon a time, there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no lion. Humankind had no rival in those days. The land Shuba Hamazi, harmony-tongued Sumer, Enki, the Lord of Abundance, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of humankind that until then had been one. This passage, which continues to puzzle and intrigue historians, reads less like a story of original creation and more like a detailed account of historical fragmentation, a memory of profound unity followed by devastating division and scattering. It positions Enki, the god of wisdom, as the agent who shattered the singular language into diverse tongues. If one studies these myriad tablets, the hymns, the king lists, the legal codes, the astronomical maps, the core pattern remains unyielding. The Sumerians never claimed to be the first. They claimed only to be the ones who remembered. A teacher's instruction to a student in a scribal school reinforces this creed. The words of the ancestors must be preserved, not created, preserved. The clay, miraculously, remembers what we have forgotten. The people who first taught humanity how to write were convinced they were documenting an inherited past, not inventing a new future. If their records are not poetic invention but factual documentation, then the established narrative of human beginnings is inverted. Civilization did not begin with the Sumerians, it survived through them. In contrast, when archaeologists examine the Egyptian Nile Delta, they find a clear, gradual developmental sequence, much like reading the growth rings of a tree, from the early, primitive Badarian culture of basic farmers up through the Nakada 1 or 2 and 3 periods, where one layer of innovation clearly builds upon the last, showing the slow, traceable evolution toward complex burials and early hieroglyphic experiments. Every stage in Egypt is visible, like climbing down a ladder rung by rung to the ground floor. Sumer offers no such ladder. It simply presents a perfectly functional, technologically advanced city, seemingly born ex nihilo, carrying forward the sacred remnants of an impossible past. In contrast to the sudden appearance of Sumer, other great civilizations exhibit a clear, traceable evolution. For instance, the majestic cities of the Indus Valley civilization, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, peaking around 2500 BCE, did not materialize overnight. Archaeologists have successfully traced their origins through the early Harappan phase, c. 3300 BCE, back to pre-Harappan settlements like Mehrgar. Mehrgar existed as a simple farming village for over 2,000 years, gradually developing foundational techniques in pottery, metallurgy, and organized trade before its descendants eventually built the first true urban centers. Similarly, in China, the sophisticated Shang dynasty c. 1600 BCE, famous for its elaborate bronze work, and the earliest oracle bone inscriptions, rests atop the early Tu culture, which itself emerged from the Longshan culture, and that, in turn, grew out of the Yangshao culture, stretching back to 5000 BCE. This layered progression, century upon century, demonstrates the expected slow process of accumulation, experimentation, and gradual sophistication, each stage meticulously preparing the ground for the next. Peoples do not suddenly wake up possessing the institutional knowledge to engineer and manage complex cities. They learn through generations of painstaking trial and error. When archaeologists excavate the earliest substantial phases of Sumerian sites, they find the architectural and organizational equivalent of a completed symphony, where the historical record demands rough drafts and countless rehearsals. The city of Uruk around 3500 BCE, in its first great urban phase, already encompassed a massive area of over 250 hectares, roughly 600 acres. Its formidable defensive walls ran for nearly 10 kilometers, constructed with millions of standardized mud bricks. The logistics and mathematics required for this feat are staggering. Building walls on this scale necessitated precise calculation of volumes, complex resource management, scheduling coordinated labor for thousands of workers, maintaining vast supply chains, and feeding the work crews over years or decades. Such an organizational capacity typically accrues only after centuries of smaller civic projects, modest temples, granaries, and simple fortifications. Yet Uruk's walls were present from the earliest layers, suggesting the founders possessed an inherited, pre-existing mastery of large-scale project management. Inside those walls, the urban layout reflects meticulous, centralized planning, distinct residential districts separated from industrial zones, temple complexes strategically positioned at cardinal points, and streets aligned to facilitate sophisticated drainage systems. The Temple of Anu, built on a massive raised platform, showcases sophisticated load-bearing architecture. Its foundations required engineers to calculate weight distribution with precision to prevent catastrophic collapse, engineering knowledge usually acquired through generations of building failures. Crucially, there are no collapsed proto-temples beneath it. There are no archaeological signs of trial and error foundations, only competence from the very first layer. This anomaly extends to the most ancient settlements. At Eridu, traditionally revered as the first Sumerian city, the earliest religious structure, Temple 1, dated to the earlier Ubaid period, c. 5000 BCE, already displays conscious architectural knowledge, a central room with an altar, niches for offerings, and careful ritual orientation. By the time Eridu entered the true Sumerian period, Temple 8, its construction was so advanced that it served as the blueprint for Ziggurats built 1,000 years later. Where did this knowledge originate? The surrounding Ubaid settlements were architecturally simple farming villages lacking monumental construction or organizational capacity. Eridu simply appears, presenting institutional architecture that would be impressive even in a far more mature civilization. The same pattern is found in hydraulic engineering. The earliest excavated levels of Lagash reveal a city immediately engaged in sophisticated irrigation management, complete with canal systems requiring advanced surveying, precise gradient calculation, and complex cooperative labor across multiple settlements. Irrigation, a seemingly simple task, is technically difficult to master. A slight miscalculation of the gradient means the water won't flow. Digging too deep exposes salt deposits that poison the fertile soil, and a failure to coordinate resource sharing inevitably sparks water conflicts. The Lagash Canal system worked from the start. There are no catastrophic failures, no abandoned channels betraying serious miscalculation buried in the archaeological record, just functional, successful water management sustaining tens of thousands. This contrasts sharply with the early Egyptian irrigation systems, which required centuries of experimentation, repeated failures, canals that constantly silted up, and seasons where crops failed due to improper timing. The Egyptians developed agricultural reliability through hard-won experience. Sumerian agriculture appears reliable from the beginning. The perfection of cuneiform, the developmental anomaly, is perhaps most pronounced in writing. When cuneiform first enters the archaeological record, c. 3400 3200 BCE, it contains approximately 700 distinct symbols. For comparison, early Egyptian hieroglyphics started with fewer than 200 symbols and took centuries to expand their vocabulary. Early Chinese oracle bone script uses roughly 5,000 characters, but those accumulated over a millennium, allowing scholars to clearly track their slow evolution from simple pictographs to complex characters. Cuneiform 700 symbols appear simultaneously in tablets across multiple cities, indicating not spontaneous, disparate invention, but the dissemination of an already standardized and established system. Furthermore, this early script is not merely a collection of simple pictographs. From its very first examples, cuneiform employs a hybrid system combining logograms, symbols representing entire words, with phonetic elements, symbols representing sounds. Such a sophisticated hybrid system typically takes centuries to evolve. Where is the proto-cuneiform? Where are the awkward transitional tablets, the ambiguous symbols, the inconsistent usage, and the competing, abandoned systems that inevitably accompany the invention of a new script? They should exist, as every known writing system leaves a clear trail of developmental debris. Instead, Sumerian cuneiform appears standardized and fully functional, as if it were taught rather than invented. This pattern of mature systems appearing without developmental stages is evident across every domain of Sumerian life, including their legal codes. Early fragments show highly sophisticated concepts, defined property rights, complex contract enforcement, compensations, scales for injuries, and nuanced inheritance laws. These are not primitive eye for an eye systems. They are sophisticated legal frameworks that distinguish between intentional and accidental harm, recognize different social classes, and include defined appeals processes. Such intricate legal frameworks normally require generations of case law and political disputes to reveal gaps and force refinement. Yet, Sumerian law appears comprehensive from its very first attestations. Archaeologists refer to this collective enigma as the Sumerian problem. It is not just that Sumer developed quickly, but that it appears not to develop at all. Between 3,500 and 3000 BCE, while other regions show simple villages slowly evolving into towns, Sumer reveals cities that appear with libraries already stocked and engineering systems already functional. Some scholars maintain that the earlier stages are simply missing, hidden by erosion, flooding, or the shifting path of the Euphrates River. Others hypothesize that Sumer's gradual development occurred elsewhere and that the sites we excavate are already mature colonies of that lost homeland. However, there remains the third, compelling possibility, the one the Sumerians themselves consistently affirmed, that they inherited their sophistication rather than developing it themselves, acting as the custodians of a lost civilization's knowledge. If Sumerian civilization, with its full technological toolkit, appeared suddenly without discernible developmental stages, the question remains, how did the Sumerians themselves account for their origins? Their answer is recorded in one of the most remarkable and controversial documents ever found, the Sumerian King List, SKL. This document makes little sense as conventional history unless it is understood as a surviving, inherited chronology. The discovery began in 1906 when German-American Assyriologist Hermann Hilprecht was cataloging fragments at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He identified a small, unique clay prism from Nippur that was not a mere receipt or hymn, but a comprehensive chronological record of every ruler who had ever held kingship over Sumer, tracing time back to its theoretical beginning. This prism, about the size of a tall coffee mug and inscribed with columns of cuneiform on all four sides, was quickly recognized as one of the most debated documents in archaeology. Numerous other fragments and copies later surfaced across the region from Larsa, Ur, and even later Babylonian versions at Nineveh, all maintaining the same consistent core structure. The text opens with the definitive foundational declaration. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. It then proceeds to list the early rulers of Eridu, Alulim, who is recorded as having reigned for 28,800 years, and his successor, Alala, who reigned for 36,000 years. The list continues through 8 kings in total, each ruling for lengths that defy human lifespans by colossal orders of magnitude. Following Eridu, the list names kings of other early centers, Batibira, Larak, Sipa, and Shuruppak, each continuing the tradition of reigns stretching into the tens of thousands of years. Then the text pivots abruptly, marked by a singular catastrophic event. The flood swept over. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Everything changes after this line. The post-flood kings rule for far more plausible, if still often exaggerated, durations, decades, perhaps a century or two. For example, Etana of Kish is given a reign of 1,500 years, an absurdity, but one that pales in comparison to the 43,200-year reign attributed to the pre-flood king Enmen-Luana of Batibira. Scholars initially dismissed the entire pre-flood section as pure mythology, a creation narrative disguised as history, where the immense numbers were symbolic of cosmic or divine ages. The post-flood section, by contrast, began to align with archaeological discovery as later names listed in the SKL matched actual rulers whose inscriptions, tombs, and historical existence were independently verifiable. The standard interpretation became myth transitions into legend, which transitions into history, with the impossible reigns being mere metaphor. However, this interpretation failed to address key questions. Why would the Sumerians present pure mythology in the same dry, bureaucratic format as their reliable historical data? Unlike their true myths, the narrative, poetic stories of Gilgamesh or Inanna, the king list, reads like a meticulous administrative record: name, city, reign length, next. No embellishment, just data. The cosmic calculation: in the 1,960 seconds, a crucial observation was made. The pre-flood reign lengths are not random. They are precise multiples of 3,600, a significant number the Sumerians called the Shah, and used as a primary unit for measuring vast time spans. Alulim's 28,800 years equals 8. Olala's 36,000 years equals 10. And Men Lu Anna's 43,200 years equals 12. This precision strongly suggests encoding rather than biography. When numbers consistently align with a mathematical benchmark, the document is likely a calculation, not a historical record of a single lifespan. The Sumerians were profoundly sophisticated astronomers who tracked celestial bodies like Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn with astonishing accuracy. They understood that these bodies move in predictable mathematical cycles. A Shah of 3,600 years is mathematically related to certain long-term celestial periods, particularly when converted into the Sumerian sexagesimal system. Scholars have since proposed that the impossible reigns of the king list encode astronomical observations spanning millennia, a continuous record of cosmic time that would require either institutional memory passed down over countless generations or critically inherited knowledge from a much earlier civilization. For example, the 43,200 years 12 Shah might not claim that Enmenluana lived that long, but that his era corresponded to 12 complete cosmic cycles. The text thus transforms from a flawed biography into an ancient, complex calendar. This reframing suggests the king list preserves a sophisticated chronological system that predates Sumerian civilization, implying the Sumerians inherited this cosmic timeline rather than inventing it. The document's structure reinforces this idea. The before the flood section follows a cosmic chronological system, epochs and cycles, while the after the flood section follows a human chronological system, centuries and decades. The flood is treated as a discrete, decisive historical event that broke continuity. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again. That phrase, lowered from heaven again, powerfully echoes the opening line. Kingship descended from heaven before the flood. This repetition suggests a cyclical restoration, an original organization followed by a catastrophe that necessitated a complete reorganization. This literary structure aligns precisely with the geological evidence. We know from excavations at Sumerian sites that a massive regional flood did strike Mesopotamia, depositing thick layers of sterile silt. Though not global, within the confines of the Sumerian world, it was an overwhelming cataclysm that submerged every city and every field. The king list perfectly describes this, a dividing event that separates two distinct realities, a before characterized by cosmic rhythms, and an after defined by human struggle. If the pre-flood section preserves sophisticated astronomical knowledge accumulated over thousands of years, and the flood physically destroyed the civilization that accumulated it, the king list becomes a salvage document, a desperate attempt to preserve chronological memory across a catastrophe. The Sumerians, perhaps no longer fully understanding what the numbers encoded, simply copied them faithfully generation after generation because the original document was sacred, a relic of the world before the waters. This preservation through reverence is visible in the physical documents. Later, scribes' copying errors, crossings out, and meticulous corrections confirm they treated the text with almost religious reverence, valuing accuracy of transcription over comprehension of its ultimate meaning. The king list, therefore, may be far older than Sumer itself, its intellectual foundation a forgotten legacy. This hypothesis received its most powerful confirmation in the late 1922 at the city of Ur. In the winter of 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley directed his team at the bottom of a deep trench beneath the famed royal cemetery, searching for Ur's earliest, most modest occupation layers. His workers were pulling up the expected debris of early habitation, pottery shards, charcoal, stone tools, when the artifacts abruptly ceased. The diggers hit a layer of clean, sterile clay, utterly uniform and void of human activity. Woolley, convinced they had hit the virgin natural substrate, was about to close the excavation when he decided, out of pure thoroughness, to dig deeper, 2.5 meters, nearly 8 feet, down through that lifeless, yellow-brown clay. The artifacts began again: pottery, flint tools, and charcoal, indicating another city, another culture, another world entirely. The earlier settlement had been buried under a thick layer of water-deposited silt. After the waters receded, a new civilization, Sumer, had built directly on top of the remains. Woolley famously dubbed the trench profile a sandwich of history: human occupation, pre-flood; catastrophic flood deposit; human occupation, Sumerian. The evidence was clear. The middle layer was not the result of gradual seasonal sedimentation, but a massive, overwhelming single event, water moving with such force and volume that it scoured the landscape clean, leaving behind only the deep, sterile layer of mud. This physical evidence validated the king list's narrative. A great flood was indeed the dividing line between two distinct worlds. When Sir Leonard Woolley published his findings from Ur, the claim that he had found archaeological evidence of a great deluge, often sensationalized as Noah's flood, generated headlines worldwide. While the biblical reference was dramatic, the archaeology was undeniably sound. The sterile flood layer at Ur dated to approximately 2,900, 3,000 BCE. This timing was critically important as it aligned almost exactly with the period when the Sumerian king list describes kingship being lowered from heaven again after the great waters had swept over. The geological evidence was not confined to Ur. At Shuruppak, the very city where the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra, equivalent to Noah, was said to have ruled, excavators uncovered the same sterile, 2-meter thick clay layer, precisely separating the artifacts of the pre-flood occupation from the later rebuilding phase. The same pattern repeated at Kish and at Eridu, where kingship was first said to descend. In all these low-lying urban centers near the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, the geological testimony was consistent. Around 2,900 BCE, a regional catastrophic inundation occurred. The flood was certainly not global. It did not cover mountains. However, for the people whose entire known universe consisted of the fertile land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia, the event was a total catastrophe, the effective end of their world. The memory of this event appears to have been carried and adapted across vast distances and cultures. The Hebrew book of Genesis describes the global deluge survived by Noah, who received divine warning and preserved life on an ark before repopulating the earth. Yet the Hebrew scriptures were predated by over 1,000 years by the Akkadian epic of Atrahasis. In this older version, the god Enki warns the righteous man Atrahasis to build a boat after the gods decide to eliminate humanity due to their overwhelming noise. Atrahasis survives, and after the waters recede, he sacrifices, leading the gods to allow humanity to continue under new, regulated conditions. The Atrahasis text, 1,800 BCE, was itself copied from even older, now fragmentary Sumerian sources, which named the hero as Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, the very city where the 2-meter flood layer was found. The geography of the myth matches the mud of the geology. This core narrative structure, warning dollar, right arrow dollar, survival vessel dollar, right arrow dollar, rebuilding, persists globally. Syria, Ugaritic text, describes the god Baal battling Yam, the primordial sea god, who threatens to overwhelm the earth. India, Hindu scriptures, records the pralaya, a cosmic deluge, where Manu is warned by a divine fish, Matsya, to build a boat and preserve the seeds of life for the next age. Mesoamerica, Aztec, Maya codices, describes multiple destructions of previous worlds by water. The Aztec fourth sun ended when the sky rained for 52 years, turning humans into fish, with only a single couple surviving to repopulate the current age. These geographically and culturally isolated civilizations, with independent development of writing and technology, nonetheless preserved functionally identical stories. Scholars debate the cause. Is it universal human psychology adapting to regional flooding, or is it the persistence of a genuine shared memory? The details: advanced warning, a designated survivor, a vessel, and the resulting reset of civilization are too consistent for random, independent invention. A third, highly plausible option, increasingly supported by geology, suggests the memory originated from a widespread event at the end of the last ice age between 12,000 and 10,000 BCE. As massive ice sheets melted, global sea levels rose over 100 meters, submerging vast coastal plains and drowning entire settlements. If early human groups witnessed this global transformation, the memory of the time before the waters came could have persisted for millennia through oral tradition, fracturing into regional myths by the time the Sumerians finally captured it in writing. For the Sumerians, the flood was not merely a myth, it was the Great Reset, a moment when continuity shattered. The Sumerian civilization that emerged afterward was therefore not inventing its civilization, but was desperately restoring it from fragments, physically and culturally rebuilding upon the ruins of a cataclysm. If the flood destroyed an earlier, advanced civilization, how did the Sumerians possess such deep, foundational knowledge in fields like mathematics and astronomy? The answer lies in the Sumerian sexagesimal, base 60, mathematical system which endures today. The division of the hour into 60 minutes, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, 60x6, the use of multiples of 6 for celestial coordinates. This base 60 system appears in the earliest Sumerian tablets with no preceding developmental stages. There are no tablets showing experiments with base 8 or base 10 before settling on 60. It is simply embedded in their weights, measures, timekeeping, geometry, and astronomy. The number 60 was chosen deliberately because it is highly composite. It is evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it extraordinarily practical for complex trade, surveying, and precise calculation. The Sumerians themselves do not claim invention. In their Eduba scribal school, educational texts, the standard phrase appears repeatedly. From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced. This passive construction places the origin of their sophisticated art outside their own living memory. School exercises found at Nippur included complex multiplication tables extending into the thousands, division problems involving fractions, calculations for compound interest, and advanced geometric formulas for calculating the areas of irregular fields. This level of mathematical literacy suggests the adult population possessed knowledge far beyond basic arithmetic. One famous artifact, the clay tablet designated YBC 7289, Yale Babylonian Collection, shows a square with its diagonals marked. Next to the diagonal, a scribe has inscribed a numerical approximation of the square root of 2 calculated to 6 decimal places. Sim $1.414213. This level of precision requires a conceptual understanding of irrational numbers, a concept typically credited to Greek mathematicians 2,000 years later. Yet, here it is, etched into clay by a Sumerian student, undoubtedly copying from an even older exemplar. The survival of this complete, complex, non-evolutionary knowledge from architecture to mathematics suggests that the Sumerians were not the founders of civilization, but the fortunate inheritors of knowledge deliberately preserved by the survivors of the Great Deluge, the ultimate cultural salvage operation. The sophistication observed in Sumerian mathematics and engineering is equally apparent in their medical knowledge. The earliest Sumerian pharmacological texts, collections of remedies and treatments, do not read like tentative experiments in healing. Instead, they function as reference manuals compiled from established, successful practice. A tablet recovered from Nippur, dated to around 2100 BCE, a copy of far older sources, lists over a dozen prescriptions using carefully balanced combinations of plants, minerals, and animal products. Examples include willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, for pain and inflammation. The texts specify dosages, preparation methods such as grinding, boiling, and straining, and expected clinical outcomes with remarkable precision. Critically, modern pharmacology has validated that many Sumerian remedies contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes. This level of precise, effective knowledge requires generations of careful, systematic observation, a period of trial and error that is completely missing from the archaeological record. The Sumerian medical corpus appears fully formed, documenting a tradition that was already ancient. The same sophistication without development is found in their metallurgy. By 3000 BCE, Sumerian smiths were routinely producing high-quality bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Bronze production demands precise temperature control and ratio management. The optimal ratio for tools is roughly 88% copper to 12% tin. Sumerian bronze consistently hits this functional ratio. The archaeological record contains no phase of trial and error, casting no brittle, poorly tempered alloys. The earliest bronze artifacts display professional quality metalwork, suggesting they either inherited the metallurgical expertise or achieved their learning phase so early and rapidly that it left no trace. Their legal codes suggest similar inheritance. Early Sumerian law fragments, predating the famous Code of Hammurabi by centuries, contain highly complex jurisprudence. Statutes distinguish clearly between premeditated and accidental harm, govern property disputes and inheritance rights, and regulate commercial contracts. Legal systems this nuanced typically evolve only after generations of accumulated case law, real disputes that expose gaps and force legislative refinement. Yet, Sumerian law appears comprehensive immediately, as if the framers already possessed a complete understanding of the full spectrum of human conflict. The most compelling evidence for an inherited legacy lies in their astronomy. The Amisaduqa tablets, commissioned in the Babylonian period but copied from much older Sumerian originals, record observations of the planet Venus over a continuous 21-year period. These are not mythological stories. They're detailed data logs. The records track Venus's appearances and disappearances with accuracy down to a single day across its full cycle. Achieving this precision requires continuous institutional monitoring spanning decades. as the Venus Synodic period, the time between identical configurations as seen from Earth, is roughly 584 days, meaning a complete cycle of its patterns takes many years to fully document. The Amishadika data preserves a consistent observational tradition that extends back into the deepest Sumerian past. Furthermore, the iconic Ziggurats that dominated Sumerian cities were not merely religious monuments, they were astronomically aligned. The famed Ziggurat of Ur, reconstructed around 2100 BCE on older foundations, aligns its corners to the cardinal directions with an error of less than 1 degree. Its main stairways often face the summer solstice sunrise. Achieving this required a sophisticated understanding of celestial motion, the ecliptic, the celestial equator, and precise terrestrial orientation. The Sumerians compiled detailed constellation lists used for timekeeping and agricultural planning. They systematically tracked lunar eclipses, meticulously recording them until they recognized the Saros cycle, the roughly 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat. This discovery demands multiple generations of preserved and compared records. All of this, the complex mathematics, the effective medicine, the nuanced law, and the centuries-spanning astronomy, appears in Sumerian civilization without the developmental scaffolding that should precede it. The expected centuries of failed experiments, miscalculated eclipse predictions, and rudimentary legal codes are missing. This returns us to the pervasive Sumerian explanation. Knowledge was given, not discovered or invented. While conventionally dismissed as primitive people attributing their own genius to the gods, the persistent pattern strongly suggests that given means inherited, passed down from teachers whose names were forgotten, from a time before a catastrophic event erased all continuity. The fact that the flood layer at Ur is 2.5 meters thick, concealing an older, culturally distinct civilization beneath it, supports the idea that knowledge survived the rising waters. It was likely carried by refugees who fled to higher ground, preserved through fragmented oral tradition, and encoded in practical disciplines whose origins no one remembered but everyone maintained. The Sumerians, therefore, were not the inventors of their sophistication, but the custodians of a profound inherited legacy. This profound inheritance is further suggested by the nature of the Sumerian language itself, which appears in history as mysteriously as the knowledge it was used to record. Languages typically evolve visibly and gradually. Much like a river carving a valley, Latin transforms into the Romance languages over centuries, a process easily tracked by linguists. The lineage of English can be traced back through Old English, Proto-Germanic, and Proto-Indo-European over 6,000 years. Sumerian, however, appears in written form around 3,300 BCE with no precursor, no parent language, and no known family tree. Linguists classify it as a linguistic isolate, a language with no known living or dead relatives anywhere on Earth. This should be impossible, as languages always develop from earlier tongues. Crucially, Sumerian bears no structural resemblance to the Semitic languages that surrounded and eventually replaced it, like Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian. Semitic languages are inflectional and rely on 3 consonant roots. Sumerian, by contrast, is agglutinative. It builds complex meaning by stringing together numerous smaller prefixes, suffixes, and infixes onto a root word, resembling languages like Turkish or Japanese, neither of which have any geographical or historical connection to ancient Mesopotamia. Linguists have spent over a century searching for relatives across Uralic, Dravidian, and Caucasian language families, but every hypothesis has failed. The vocabulary and grammar simply refused to align. The only settled explanation is that Sumerian represents the last survivor of an otherwise extinct language family, a linguistic lineage whose other branches disappeared without trace. This raises the critical timing question: when did they vanish? The timing is suggestive. Sumerian appears in writing around 3300 BCE, and the catastrophic flood layers date to around 2900 BCE. If Sumerian was the primary language of the advanced pre-flood cities buried beneath the silt, then its isolation makes historical sense. The disaster that deposited 2.5 meters of sterile clay also erased the entire linguistic context, the sibling languages, the dialects, the parent tongues that would have made Sumerian comprehensible. We would be looking at the single last surviving dialect of a great drowned language family. Linguists studying Sumerian have identified several peculiarities that strongly suggest the influence of a substrate language, the traces of an older tongue that affected the structure of Sumerian. Certain grammatical features do not fit cleanly into the expected agglutinative pattern. Specific word orders appear to be borrowed, and inconsistent phonetic quirks emerge. It is as if Sumerian is a hybrid, a language that absorbed and fossilized structural elements from an earlier, unknown tongue. This linguistic hybridization occurs when two distinct language groups intermarry, or when a dominant culture imposes its speech on a subject population. The resulting language carries the ghosts of both parent tongues. The fundamental question is, what was this substrate language? What earlier language left its indelible fingerprints in Sumerian grammar? The answer remains elusive because whatever it was, it is completely extinct and left no independent records. This fits perfectly with the flood hypothesis. If Sumerians' relatives vanished, they vanished during the catastrophic cultural break around 2900 BCE. Sumerian did not die easily. Even after Akkadian, a Semitic language brought by new populations, became the dominant spoken language of Mesopotamia, around 2500 BCE, Sumerian persisted. For over a millennium, the two languages coexisted. Akkadian was used for daily communication, but Sumerian remained the language of scholarship, ritual, and high culture. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian was no longer anyone's native language. No children learned it at home, yet it was kept alive artificially. Babylonian kings commissioned Sumerian inscriptions to legitimize their rule. Scholars meticulously copied Sumerian texts to preserve ancient wisdom. Priests maintained Sumerian liturgies, believing the gods preferred the older tongue. Sumerian became the sacred language of the Mesopotamian world, serving as the key to a revered, older knowledge, much like Latin would function in medieval Europe. Babylonian scribes created comprehensive bilingual dictionaries, painstakingly translating Sumerian texts into Akkadian to ensure the knowledge would not be lost. They treated the language with reverence, believing its words held a power that transcended mere communication. One scribe, copying a Sumerian hymn around 1800 BCE, added a note in Akkadian. The ancient words must not be altered. They contain the wisdom before the Great Change. The Great Change could refer to the flood, the linguistic shift, or something much older. The Babylonians themselves were not sure, but they understood that preserving Sumerian meant preserving access to something essential. The commitment was profound. The last cuneiform tablet ever written, dated as late as 75 CE, during the Roman Empire, still contained Sumerian phrases. Sumerian was more than a language. It was a time capsule, the final linguistic remnant of a world that existed before the catastrophic flood, preserved because the culture that inherited it believed correctly that its words contained secrets the modern world had forgotten. If Sumerian is a linguistic fossil, then the language itself is proof, evidence that a pre-flood civilization existed, was sophisticated enough to require complex written communication, and vanished so completely that only this single tongue survived. If Sumerian is the language of a forgotten age, what ancient memories did it preserve? Most ancient creation myths, such as the Hebrew Genesis or the Hindu Rig Veda, describe creation through instantaneous divine command, a word or a breath that manifests perfect reality without struggle. Sumerian creation myths are fundamentally different. They describe problems, mistakes, iterations, and adjustments made across multiple attempts before functional humans are created. If these are myths, they are unusually honest about failure. If they are metaphors, they are remarkably specific about process. The Atrahasis epic, c. 1800 BCE, copied from older Sumerian sources, opens not with creation, but with a divine labor dispute. The younger gods, Igigi, are exhausted from the crushing labor of maintaining the world, digging irrigation channels, dredging rivers, and building temples. After 3,600 years, one Shah cycle, they revolt, demanding relief. The elder gods convene, and Enki, the god of wisdom, proposes the solution. Let a birth goddess create a subservient species, man to assume the god's drudgery. Let man bear the yoke, let him carry the basket of the gods. The creation process is not instantaneous, it requires experimentation. The goddess Nintu, or Belet Ili, collaborates with Enki to fashion the first prototype. Ingredients: they use clay from the Apsu, the primordial freshwater abyss, and mix it with the blood of a slain god, Illa, whose essence is needed to provide something the clay lacks. The ingredients are explicitly physical matter, clay, animating essence, divine blood, and a vessel, the birth gods, trial and error. Nintu shapes the forms, but the first beings are defective. The Enki and Ninma text details this phase. She creates a human who cannot hold back urine. Enki assigns it a role that requires no control. She creates another who cannot close its mouth or speak clearly. Enki assigns it a role as a musician. The process continues through multiple flawed prototypes, beings with physical and cognitive defects. Adaptation. For each defective being, Enki assigns a specialized role based on the limitation. The text reads less like divine poetry and more like a clinical record. Attempt, defect adaptation, next attempt. The language is distinctly procedural. The gods mix, shape, test, adjust, and iterate. This is engineering, not miracle. Humans are ultimately created not for companionship, but specifically to work, to maintain the infrastructure, and perform the agricultural labor the gods found tedious. The divine essence mixed into the clay is called temu, a word that can mean intelligence, consciousness, or understanding. The myth treats this temu as a transferable substance that animates the inert clay. Why include the process of sequential experimentation and failure if the ultimate purpose is simply a theological reflection on human imperfection? The myth functions as detailed quality control documentation. The Sumerian account stands alone among ancient creation stories in its inclusion of failure, adjustment, and incremental improvement, the hallmarks of a difficult, prolonged process. The ancient world lacked the concepts and vocabulary of modern genetics or biological inheritance. If a pre-literate culture were attempting to document a process they had inherited or observed, perhaps selective breeding or some form of controlled life creation, they would have been forced to use the only framework available: mythic narrative, where gods performed the work that human observers could not explain scientifically. The structure of the myth itself is the memory, a record of trial and error that preceded the functional creation of mankind. The procedural nature of the Sumerian creation myths, such as those found in the Atrahasis and Enki and Ninmah texts, strongly suggest that the stories function as narrative containers for processes the Sumerians observed but could not explain scientifically. Phrases like the gods mixed clay with divine essence might be the only available language to express that someone systematically combined specific known elements to create new life forms. Similarly, the detailed accounts that they made mistakes and corrected them serve as the only way to preserve the memory that the process involved failure, testing, and refinement before a functional product emerged. These texts are procedural, not purely poetic. They describe steps, sequences, and outcomes, sounding more like technical documentation translated into mythological language simply because the necessary scientific vocabulary did not yet exist. What if the Sumerians inherited a fragmentary memory of intentional biological creation observations made by a pre-flood culture that understood processes of selection and refinement? The earliest scribes, attempting to capture these oral traditions, could not write. A deliberate process involving selection and refinement produced modern humans. They lacked the conceptual framework, but they could write, "The gods shaped us from earth and essence, tried and failed, then tried again until we worked." The creation tablets are unambiguous. Humanity was made deliberately, carefully, through a process that required skill, knowledge, and multiple attempts. The gods in these narratives are active participants with defined roles. Enki provides the wisdom, design, Nintu. Ninmah provides the biological vessel, and lesser deities carry out the physical labor. If we strip away the divine names and read these as process documents, as records of how, rather than who, the texts become a powerful form of testimony, someone, somewhere, possessed the understanding to intentionally shape life. The Sumerians preserved that understanding in the only format that could survive without scientific terminology: myth. This question of who possessed such knowledge leads directly to the core figures of the Sumerian pantheon, the Anunnaki. The Sumerian term Anunnaki linguistically breaks down as Anunnaki, the offspring of Anu, the sky god. They appear across thousands of texts, invoked as the great gods who decree fate. They function as the administrative tier of the cosmos, acting as judges, lawgivers, and managers who oversaw the world's operation. Crucially, the texts assign them specific practical portfolios. Enki governs wisdom, fresh water, and craftsmanship, credited with teaching humans irrigation, mathematics, and writing. Enlil controls the wind, storms, and agriculture, determines the success of crops. Inanna commands war, love, and the movements of Venus. Utu presides over justice and the sun's daily course. They are active participants, credited with establishing cities, introducing technology, and instructing humanity in the very arts that define civilization. One hymn states that Enki spread the pickaxe and the basket and laid the foundations for the settlements, describing the teaching of actual infrastructure, not symbolic piety. What makes the Anunnaki strange is their portrayal. They are powerful, yet they are not omnipotent. They grow tired, leading to the creation of humans. They make errors. They convene councils to debate decisions, and they are subject to very human consequences: eating, drinking, and experiencing emotions. They are presented as rulers who once walked among humans. This has led to the controversial hypothesis that the Anunnaki were not purely mythological beings, but rather ancestral elites, pre-flood leaders, or a highly advanced ruling class whose memory was preserved and gradually elevated to divine status. This process of ancestor deification is common, for example, Roman emperors, Egyptian pharaohs. If the Anunnaki were survivors of the pre-flood world who preserved crucial knowledge, their later mythologization makes historical sense as memory faded and the distance from the catastrophe grew. Sumerian theology supports this. The Anunnaki inhabit the physical world, living in temples that require maintenance, consuming physical food offerings, and even having offspring who intermarry with humans, producing hybrid lineages. The Sumerian king list records early kings as children of divine fathers and human mothers, suggesting either mythological legitimization of royalty or a genuine belief that certain lineages descended from these pre-flood elites. This pattern is not isolated to Mesopotamia. Strikingly similar figures appear across unrelated cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Egypt, the Netjeru, described in temple inscriptions as teachers who arrived in pre-dynastic times to establish law, agriculture, and astronomy, portrayed with human characteristics interacting directly with early Egyptians. Hindu tradition, the Devas, celestial beings who descend periodically to instruct humanity during cosmic transitions, establishing dharma, cosmic law, and guiding civilization. Mesoamerica, figures like Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, bring writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture, the same portfolio attributed to Enki. Viracocha in Incan mythology performs identical functions after catastrophes. Greek mythology, the Titans, Prometheus. Primordial beings who ruled before the Olympian gods and taught humans fire, metalwork, and law, with Prometheus specifically giving humanity knowledge against the will of the gods. Early Jewish texts, the Watchers. Angels who descended to earth, intermarried with humans, and taught forbidden knowledge, metalworking, warfare, astrology, accelerating civilization, but also corrupting it. These parallels are compelling because the narrative structure repeats consistently. Advanced, anthropomorphic beings descend from elsewhere, interact with humanity, provide knowledge that enables civilization, and then either depart or are removed by catastrophe, divine intervention. Independent invention should produce far more variation. Instead, the pattern holds, suggesting not simple cultural borrowing, diffusion theory, but a shared ancestral memory of a truly significant event in humanity's deep past, the transmission of knowledge from an earlier, advanced culture to later ones. The Sumerian accounts, with the Anunnaki and their explicit role in establishing technology and law, may be the oldest written testimony of this global memory. The Anunnaki, the teachers of the Sumerians, the Netjeru of the Egyptians, the Devas of the Hindus, the sky serpents of the Mesoamericans represent different names for the same function. They are the figures who taught us. Perhaps we have been reading these foundational accounts backward. Maybe these gods were not invented to explain the mysteries of existence, but were invented to preserve the memory of people who actually explained those mysteries, individuals who possessed knowledge so profound it was worth remembering, whose identities were eventually lost, but whose legacy survived, encoded in a divine form. In this reading, the Anunnaki become testimony. The Sumerian attempt to document who gave them the knowledge that seemed too sophisticated to have developed locally, who they remembered as the original bringers, not the original creators of civilization. the uncomfortable truth of history. This brings us to the central haunting question. What if the Sumerians were not remembering myth at all, but history fragmented, mythologized, but fundamentally grounded in events that occurred before the flood swept over and kingship was lowered from heaven again? To answer this, we must gather every thread. Sudden appearance. A civilization that appears fully formed cities, mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine emerging simultaneously, violating every known model for cultural evolution. The archaeology confirms that Sumer starts near the top. The encoded chronology, the king list preserving astronomical cycles in reigns no human could survive, divided by a catastrophic flood that left a verifiable, meters-thick layer of sterile silt across every city the Sumerians knew. The isolated language, Sumerian appearing without ancestry or evolutionary history, a linguistic isolate that stands alone, suggesting it is a fossil of a speech community that vanished so completely that only this single dialect was preserved. The procedural myths, creation stories that read like process documentation, trial and error, failed prototypes, and incremental refinement, the language of experimentation translated into the only vocabulary available, the actions of gods, inherited knowledge, mathematical systems base 6-0 that remain embedded in our measures of time and space, astronomical records requiring centuries of continuous observation, and medical knowledge, for example, willow bark, confirmed by modern pharmacology, all described as given, not invented. The Anunnaki, teachers, judges, and bringers of knowledge, portrayed not as distant forces, but as beings who lived among humans, establishing the foundations of civilization before fading into memory and divinity. What if none of this is mythology? What if the Sumerians were exactly what they claimed to be, archivists of an earlier age, custodians of knowledge that survived catastrophe? The flood is the pivot point. Before it, a culture sophisticated enough to develop base 6-0 mathematics, precise astronomy, and complex language. After it, survivors rebuilding from fragments, passing down stories that gradually transformed from testimony into myth as the original context drowned beneath silt and time. We have spent 150 years insisting the Sumerians must be speaking metaphorically because the alternative, that they restored civilization rather than invented it, rewrites everything we thought we knew about humanity's timeline. But what if they meant it literally? What if the clay tablets are not imaginative literature, but documentary evidence, the earliest surviving testimony about who we are and where we came from? Every wedge-shaped mark pressed into wet clay is a message from a world that no longer exists. They called it restoration. They called it memory. They said knowledge was given. Myths don't leave fingerprints in clay. Myths don't encode astronomical observations accurate to within a day. Myths don't preserve mathematical systems still functional after 5 millennia. Myths don't create language, isolates with no developmental history. Memory does. Did the Sumerians record humanity's true origin? And have we spent centuries mistaking memory for myth? In the darkness of museum archives, those fingerprints remain the pulse of a scribe who lived 6,000 years ago, frozen in clay, reaching across time to tell us something we've forgotten how to hear.